So it is 9 o'clock here in Helsinki, Finland, and we are going to start our webinar. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control in cooperation with the Australian Institute of Criminology. We are thrilled to have you with us today. My name is Anni Lietonen. I will be your host for the session. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please keep your cameras off and microphones closed until the Q&A session starts. You are free to post your comments and questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and presenters are free to respond after their presentations directly in the chat. But we will also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So this webinar will also be recorded. And if you experience any technical issues, please let us know in the chat and we will do our best to assist. But let's move forward. I am delighted to give the floor to Dr. Rick Brown, the Deputy Director of the Australian Institute of Criminology, and he will give an opening speech for us today. Good morning.
Good morning, Annie. And it's great to be here for another joint HEUNI AIC seminar on what is such an important topic. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I and most of my AIC colleagues join you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to welcome any First Nations colleagues attending today, and indeed welcome everyone joining us today. Now, the Australian Institute of Criminology is Australia's national research and knowledge centre on crime and justice, and our role is to promote justice and reduce crime by undertaking criminological research. And we do that by working closely with stakeholders both nationally and internationally. And along with HEUNI, the AIC is also a member of the UN's Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Programme Network, which is a network of national and international institutes working on research and delivering training and disseminating knowledge on crime prevention and criminal justice. And this network helps to support the UN Office on Drugs and Crime to deliver on its mandate. But one of the real benefits of the network is the opportunity to work jointly with other institutes, and it's a real delight to be working with our colleagues from HEUNI on this webinar series. Now, online platforms have become key enablers of certain forms of child sexual exploitation, including the production and distribution of child sexual abuse material and the delivery of commercial sexual services by children. These platforms have also become important ways through which perpetrators can share material, trade in offending tactics, and generate opportunities to sexually exploit children. As part of our programme of research at the AIC into online sexual exploitation of children, we've been endeavouring to better understand different aspects of this rapidly evolving problem in order to inform effective responses. But this is very much a cross-border problem, so forums such as this are vital for bringing together our international colleagues, sharing knowledge across different corners of the globe, and ultimately bolstering our collective efforts to address this problem. So I hope today's webinar will help us all to think about ways in which we can all play a role in tackling this particular issue. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Annie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. Next, we will hear a welcoming speech from the Director of HEUNI, Dr. Natalia Ollus.
Thanks, Anni. And thanks, Rick, for your introductory words. Also, on behalf of HEUNI, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this joint webinar. We're with Anni here in Helsinki, Finland. It's morning, it's a summer's morning, and I'm very happy to welcome participants also from other time zones. As Rick said, this is a joint endeavor by HEUNI and AIC. We've both been working, AIC and HEUNI that is, for the past 15 years on exploitation of migrant workers, on human trafficking, on modern slavery, on sexual exploitation. And we've also shared a lot of information between our two institutes. And often it's a bit funny that we come up with a topic that we think is very innovative and new, only to realize that the AIC has already researched this topic and is publishing something. So AIC is a really great inspiration to us here at HEUNI. Just a very few words about what HEUNI is. We're an independent research institute under the administration of the Finnish Ministry of Justice, but we also have an affiliation with the United Nations, as Rick mentioned, the so-called PNI network. Our aim is to strengthen the rights of individuals in vulnerable positions by advancing the prevention of crime and strengthening access to justice and remedy. And we do this by doing research and information collection, and then we try to increase the knowledge base. We also then share our information through dissemination and training, and therefore we try to increase the awareness and capacity among key actors. And this webinar is one of these activities where we try to increase the understanding of practitioners and others. And then we want to change activities, we want to change practices, and in the longer run, these practices will be taken on board and then created as guidelines and legislation. Well, our strategic programmatic areas of research include human trafficking, criminal justice processes, also social sustainability and gender-based violence. And finally, although we're based in Helsinki, our work is international and most of our research and our projects reach also outside of Finland. So please do not hesitate to contact us if you're interested in cooperation. And great to be here today, and I'm really happy to see the discussions today on this very important topic, and we look forward to learning a lot from our Australian colleagues. Thank you, Anni.
Thank you very much, Natalia. So without further ado, let's dive into the topic itself. Next, we have Samantha Lyneham to give us an introduction to the topic of online child sexual exploitation. She is a principal research analyst at the AIC. She has over 10 years of experience in a range of human trafficking and exploitation related issues, such as forced marriage, sexual and labor exploitation, orphanage trafficking, and recently she has also looked more closely about the role of technology in facilitating these crimes. So please, Samantha, welcome.
Thank you, Annie and Natalia, for inviting me to introduce the topic of child exploitation today. Modern slavery is an issue that is increasingly affecting children, and they are victims of a wide range of types of exploitation, but child victims of modern slavery are most likely to experience sexual exploitation. Modern slavery is really an umbrella term, and it encompasses behaviours associated with trafficking in persons and slavery-like conditions in Australia. And the offences in Australia that are kind of related in this category are slavery, human trafficking, online child exploitation, and also situations where an offender travels abroad to engage in sexual activity with a child. And they're all situated together in our National Criminal Code. But there are a number of child sexual abuse offences that are also contained within state and territory legislation. So child exploitation cases may or may not fall under the definition of child trafficking, depending on whether there has been movement of a child across or within borders for the purpose of exploitation. And of course, in the case of children, the means of coercion, threat, or deception doesn't necessarily need to be proven in the case of child trafficking. Only the act of recruiting a child for the purpose of exploitation. Both officially recorded crime statistics as well as estimations of prevalence reveal that children, and especially girls, comprise a substantial proportion of sexual exploitation victims globally. The global estimates of modern slavery produced by ILO and Walk Free reveal that about 1.7 million children are in situations of commercial sexual exploitation, and that 4 out of 5 victims are girls. Similarly, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, which contains recorded crime statistics, shows that children account for approximately 1/3 of detected modern slavery victims, and that most are victims of child sexual exploitation as well. Child exploitation victims are also twice as likely to be subjected to violence than adult victims, And girls especially are more likely to suffer explicit or extreme violence compared to boys and men. So to provide a little bit more Australian context, I've just collated the number of modern slavery reports made to the Australian Federal Police by offence type for the most prevalent offences reported since 2013. Australia introduced criminal legislation for modern slavery offences in 2005. However, I've collated these statistics from 2013 as that is when Australia criminalised forced marriage as a modern slavery offence. And in Australia, forced marriage is considered a form of exploitation, and internationally it's also been labelled as a specific form of sexual exploitation. And it is most likely to involve child victims. So as you can see from this graph, forced marriage, which is represented by the red line soaring above the others, quickly became the most commonly reported offence type. And it surpassed sexual servitude, which is the orange line, and also forced labour, which is the grey line, just 1 year after it became a criminal offence. And then it quickly increased to almost 100 cases per year, where it has remained relatively steady over the past couple of years. All of the other offence types shown here have seen an upward trend overall. There have been some fluctuations across specific years, but of particular relevance here is the 5-fold increase in cases of child trafficking since 2019-20. And for the past 2 years, there has been an average of about 20 cases of child trafficking per year. However, there have only been 2 successful prosecutions for child trafficking in Australia, and both of those cases involved parents placing their young children into situations of commercial sexual exploitation. So as you can see from this next graph, a range of modern slavery offences have been prosecuted in Australia, and these include both adult and child victims, and they cover the specific offences of slavery, human trafficking, which includes child trafficking, and servitude, which also includes both domestic and sexual servitude. But in cases of child sexual exploitation that have been prosecuted as child trafficking, prosecutors have also utilised state and territory child sexual abuse legislation, and they've done that to a higher degree of success than the modern slavery offences. So it's these state and territory-based child sexual abuse offences that are most likely to be proven. And as you can see, 91% of these types of charges resulted in a conviction. And that's more than any other type of modern slavery or additional charge that was proceeded against alongside the modern slavery offences. This, of course, represents a minute fraction of child exploitation cases affecting Australian children or involving Australian offenders. And that's because these cases are most likely dealt with under national child exploitation legislation or the state and territory child sexual abuse legislation rather than as human trafficking or slavery offences. So perhaps more accurately, the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation reported more than 33,000 cases of online child exploitation that they received in 2021. And that led to the Australian Federal Police charging 237 people with more than 2,000 child abuse related offences. We also know that perpetrators use technology during all stages of the trafficking process and for all forms of exploitation, whether trafficking is involved or not. And over the past few years, we have seen an increase in the use of online recruitment of children, the increase in children being advertised as adults on sexual services websites, and the increase in live streaming of child sexual exploitation and the production and distribution of child abuse material. This has largely been attributed to lockdown measures, increased economic stability, and increased vulnerability among women and children resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. The live streaming of child sexual exploitation has also been referred to as a form of cyber sex trafficking. And the significance of that is that it removes the need for children to be moved across borders for the purpose of exploitation. But the characteristics of this type of offending have similarities regardless of whether exploitation is occurring on or offline. And in particular, perpetrators who are coercing children into child sexual exploitation are often individuals rather than organised crime groups, and they tend to be parents and other relatives. So I'll leave it there. I'll hand back to you, Annie, and I look forward to Michael and Tim presenting in greater detail some of their research, which they've conducted on the ways in which online domains support the perpetration of child sexual exploitation. But thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions at the end after we hear from the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for this introduction. Our next speaker is Michael Cahill, and he will dive a little bit deeper into the topic of sexual exploitation of children in Australia. And Michael is a research analyst at the AIC. He has worked with research topics related to juvenile sexual offending in Australia, child sexual offenders in the darknet, and the sexual exploitation of children on dating platforms. Please, Michael, thank you.
Hi all, thanks Annie for the introduction, and thank you everyone for taking the time today to attend this webinar. Today I will be talking about the sexual exploitation of children on dating platforms and experiences of re-victimization as an adult. Now, this paper that I'm discussing today has been through peer review and is scheduled for release next financial year, so keep an eye out for it on the AIC website when it's released. So child sexual abuse is a global issue that is growing rapidly. In 2016, Tinder banned under 18s from using its platform after numerous reports of adults posing as children in order to have sexual contact with underage users. But evidence has suggested that children still use them, creating opportunities for offenders to interact with children and ultimately exploit and abuse them. So this current research builds on the AIC's recent report into dating platforms by exploring underage use of dating platforms, experiences with receiving sexually exploitative requests, and the effect that this has on adult re-victimization. So in 2021, the AIC conducted a survey of Australians aged 18 plus who had used a dating app or website in the previous 5 years. The survey had almost 10,000 respondents, and the data used proportional quota sampling, which means that it was representative of Australians who use dating apps and websites rather than a representation of the entire Australian population. So the findings I'm discussing today have all come from this survey and make up part of a larger body of work on dating platforms. All research on this topic can be found on the AIC website, so go check it out if you haven't already. So the study I'll be talking about today examines respondents who use dating platforms whilst under the age of 18. So respondents were asked, how old were you when you first started using dating apps or websites? So a total of 883 respondents, about 9% of the total sample, indicated that they had used a dating platform when under the age of 18. Of these 883 respondents, 51% were women, 47% were men, and about 2% were non-binary. So those respondents that reported using a dating platform below the age of 18 were then asked if someone they had connected with who knew their real age ever did any of the following: asked you to send sexual photos or videos of yourself, asked if they could meet in person, or offered to pay you for photos or videos of yourself or to be on webcam for them. So of those 883 respondents, we found that almost 60% of them received a sexually exploitative request from another dating platform user who knew they were under 18. More specifically, 54% received a request for sexual videos or photos of themselves. 65% received a request to meet in person, and about 32% were offered money for photos, videos, or live streams of themselves. Further to this, over a third of under 18 respondents received a request for sexual photos or videos of themselves from multiple users. And almost a fifth of under 18 respondents were offered payment for photos, videos, or live streams of themselves from multiple users. So next we wanted to see if these underage requests had an impact on re-victimization as an adult. So respondents that were asked to meet someone in person were excluded from this analysis. This was because voluntarily meeting someone cannot be defined as child sexual abuse or exploitation. Respondents aged 18 to 24 were also excluded, and this was to reduce the risk of respondents double counting victimization experiences as both victimization under the age of 18 and victimization as an adult. So we made three groups: respondents who did not use dating platforms whilst underage, respondents that did use dating platforms whilst underage but did not receive any exploitative requests, and respondents that did use dating platforms while underage and did receive at least one sexually exploitative request. So we ran regression models to determine whether the two under 18 respondent groups were more likely than the non-under 18 respondents to experience online or offline harms. So under 18 respondents who did not receive an exploitative request were no more likely than non-under 18 respondents to experience an online or offline harm. Under 18 respondents who did receive an exploitative request were 8 times more likely to experience an online harm and nearly 5 times more likely to experience an offline harm than respondents who did not use a dating platform while underage. So let me just repeat that to really emphasize those findings. So under 18 respondents who did receive a sexually exploitative request were 8 times more likely to experience an online harm and nearly 5 times more likely to experience an offline harm than respondents who did not use a dating platform while underage. Following on from the previous slide, we determined whether under 18 users experienced a greater number of harm than non-under 18 users. So we found that under 18 respondents who did not receive requests did not experience more harms than non-under 18 respondents. Under 18 respondents who did receive requests, however, experienced 42% more forms of online harms and 72% more forms of offline harms than respondents who did not use a dating platform while under the age of 18. Next, we determined whether under 18 respondents were more likely to experience harms from multiple people compared to non-under 18 respondents. Under 18 respondents who did not receive requests were no more likely to experience harm from multiple people compared to the non-under 18 respondents. Under 18 respondents who did receive requests were also no more likely to experience offline harms from multiple people, but they were almost twice as likely to experience online harms from multiple people. We then determined whether under 18 respondents experienced a greater number of harms from multiple people than non-under 18 respondents. So we found that under 18 respondents who did not receive a request did not experience more forms of harm than non-under 18 respondents. Under 18 respondents who did receive requests also did not experience more offline harms from multiple people, but they did experience 17% more online harms from multiple people. So following this regression analysis, marginal analysis was conducted to determine the predicted probability of underage respondents experiencing an online and offline form of dating app facilitated sexual violence. So in these figures, respondents who did not use a dating platform while underage are dark green. Respondents who used a dating platform while underage but did not receive a sexually exploitative request from another user are light blue, and respondents who used a dating platform while underage and did receive a sexually exploitative request are grey. So just keep that colour pattern in mind as I go through these following figures. So the analysis found that about 70% of respondents that did not use a dating platform while underage would go on to experience online dating app facilitated sexual violence. And about 70% of underage respondents that did not receive any sexually exploitative request would go on to experience online dating app facilitated sexual violence. However, 94% of underage respondents that did receive a sexually exploitative request will go on to experience online dating app facilitated sexual violence. So that's nearly the entire sample of respondents. A similar difference between the groups was observed for offline dating app facilitated sexual violence. So about 40% of respondents who did not use a dating platform while underage would go on to experience offline dating app facilitated sexual violence. And about 30% of underage respondents that did not receive any exploitative requests would go on to experience offline dating app facilitated sexual violence. But about 2/3 of underage respondents that did receive a sexually exploitative request would go on to experience offline dating app facilitated sexual violence. So some quite alarming numbers there. This next figure shows the predicted number of online and offline forms of dating app facilitated sexual violence experienced by underage and non-underage dating platform respondents. So respondents who did not use dating platforms while underage and underage respondents who did not receive any requests would go on to experience about 4 forms of online dating app facilitated sexual violence. So that's that dark green and that light blue column. However, the underage respondents who did receive requests would go on to experience about 5.5 forms of online dating app facilitated sexual violence. Respondents who did not use dating platforms while underage and underage respondents who did not receive any requests would go on to experience about 1 form of offline dating app facilitated sexual violence, while underage respondents who did receive requests would go on to experience about 2 forms of offline dating app facilitated sexual violence. This next figure shows the probability of the groups experiencing dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. So about 70% of respondents who did not use a dating platform while underage would experience offline dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple users. And about 70% of underage respondents who did not receive any requests would go on to experience online dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. However, almost 80% of underage respondents who did receive a sexually exploitative request would go on to experience dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. In comparison to offline dating app facilitated sexual violence, 50% of respondents from all 3 groups would go on to experience offline dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. So not much difference there. When we look at the predicted number of online and offline forms of dating app facilitated sexual violence experienced from multiple people, which is this current figure here, we can see that non-underage respondents and underage respondents who did not receive a sexually exploitative request would experience about 2.7, 2.8 forms of online dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. Underage respondents who did receive requests, however, would experience about 3.2 forms of online dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. Again, compared to offline dating app facilitated sexual violence, all 3 groups would experience about between 1.2 and 1.4 forms of offline dating app facilitated sexual violence from multiple people. So again, not a lot of difference when examining offline forms of dating app facilitated sexual violence. So to summarize this report, about 9% of survey respondents used a dating platform when under the age of 18. Of these underage respondents, almost 60% received a sexually exploitative request from another user that knew the respondent was underage. And these exploitative requests included asking for sexual images or videos, asking to meet in person, and offering money for sexual content of the respondent. Underage respondents that received a sexually exploitative request were more likely than non-underage respondents to experience online and offline dating app facilitated sexual violence as an adult. And those respondents were also more likely than non-underage respondents to experience more forms of online and offline dating app facilitated sexual violence as an adult. So some implications of this study. We found that victimization of underage individuals on dating platforms increases the likelihood of adult re-victimization. Increasing knowledge among dating platform users and caregivers is an important strategy in preventing further harm, particularly raising awareness of the risks associated with using dating platforms while under the age of 18. There also needs to be a greater responsibility by dating platforms to prevent access to under 18s. For example, age verification is currently available on some platforms, but this isn't a mandatory feature, and users can still access the platform without verifying their age. Platforms need to be stricter in their features to prevent under 18s from accessing their platforms. Ideally, a combination of these two approaches is required, as each strategy on their own cannot do so much. So this would involve tech companies regulating their platform and grassroots education and prevention approaches aimed at young people and their caregivers. So thank you everyone for listening in, and I will pass back to Annie, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this interesting discussion. So we will try and save our questions to the end, to the Q&A session, and we will move on with the program. But I would just like to remind you that if you have any specific questions, you can also post them on the chat. So our next speaker is Dr. Timothy Cubitt, who is the Acting Research Manager in the AIC's Online Sexual Exploitation of Children Research Program. Timothy's research has not only focused on today's topic, but also on radicalization and violent extremism, law enforcement responses to outlaw motorcycle gangs, and police misconduct. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie. And thank you for arranging and organizing today's event. Can I just check, can everyone see my slides up on the screen? I'll assume if there's no objection, then it's up. So my name is Timothy Cubitt. I'm the Acting Research Manager of the Online Sexual Exploitation of Children Research Program at the AIC. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of online domains and technology by perpetrators of child sexual exploitation. So the Online Sexual Exploitation of Children, or OSEC, research program at the AIC has been conducting research for some time now, focusing not only on the experiences of exploitation of victim survivors of OSEC, but also on the perpetration of these offences. And that's a bit about what I'm going to talk on today. We've been publishing extensively on these subject matter, so please don't hesitate to pop across to the AIC website, and I'll put up a QR code at the end as a bit of a link to our publications. So the OSEC program at the AIC focuses on a range of areas. This is a bit of a snapshot of our current project. So we are undertaking surveys of adult sexual offenders, a survey of adolescents and their experiences of sexual exploitation. We have data collection on pre-detection help seeking among individuals who view child sexual abuse material, where we have an ongoing project looking at perpetrators of child sexual offences on the darknet and their interactions. Michael has just spoken on our dating apps research. We have a forthcoming series of publications on sexual extortion, focusing on children, and their uses of online domains and the live streaming of child sexual abuse, as Sam Lyneham spoke about earlier on. But for this presentation, I'm going to be talking about perpetrators on the darknet. So I'll just give a slight content warning. I'm going to be reading out some of the quotes of individuals on the darknet who have been engaging with each other discussing child sexual offences. They're curated, however, some may find them distressing. So this is a bit of a warning for what is contained in the rest of the presentation. So the key to this research was a focus on interactions between child sexual offenders on the darknet. What you can see on the screen right now is often typical data collection in social science or criminological research, where a subject or a participant provides information or data to a researcher. And that little box you can see around the subject there is the context within which they exist. So oftentimes they provide us information from their context, but when we analyze and look at that information, it's absent of the context. With this research, what we've done is slightly different. So we've scraped Darknet Forum, which was populated by child sexual offenders. The intention of this forum was to give them a place to interact. What that means is that we're researching and using as data the interactions between subjects, meaning that those interactions occur within their context, and we are observing those interactions from the outside, which is a really unique possibility. It provides really unique insight into these types of communities, and that's exactly what we wanted to know. We wanted to know what types of interactions were occurring between these individuals and whether there was what could be described as a community. There's a tendency to view child sexual offenders, and particularly online child sexual offenders, as a disparate group of individuals who may offend in isolation. We were interested to know the degree to which the community existed. And so that context is extremely important. The data for this research emerged from a darknet forum specifically for individuals who self-identified as pedophile and who held conservative views of sexual contact with children. In the words of one forum user, this meant someone who does not have intimate sexual relations or engage in inappropriate touching with children because of moral or ethical reasons. And that last bit's really important. The motivation for not offending among this group was reported to be for moral and or ethical reasons. So when we started analyzing the data, we began scraping information from 2012 onward. You can see that there was the number of posts over time diminished up until 2019, and then again they increased significantly. And what we can assume, what we can infer from that is that the forum was reducing in the volume of posts and posters, but then around the time of COVID, it picked up substantially again. What I'll just point out here is that there does appear from these numbers to be a fairly significant amount of attrition on this forum. Each year, the number of those who are posting and the number of people who have joined the forum that year, who had begun posting in that same calendar year, were roughly similar. That we assume to mean that there was a relatively high degree of attrition. However, as you can see, there was a reasonably consistent volume of posts across time. So from these posts and interactions on the forum, we began looking at the cognitive drivers of offending. And from this, we began picking through the posts to understand what were the components of the cognition of these individuals that supported their continued offending. The first was the normalizing of sexual offences against children. As one forum user said, I spent 2 decades thinking I was a monster. Life is better now. I've stopped hating my own nature. It was an intellectual breakthrough, a realization that I'd been misapplying my moral code. These interactions between forum users supported one another to normalize their offending behavior and to allow what they often described as a breakthrough, a realization that they were misapplying their moral code in believing their behavior was abnormal. Second, relocating responsibility and denying impacts was very common. This forum user said, I'm not neglectful of the fact that their offending behavior can be beneficial and healthy as opposed to detrimental, meaning that there was support on the forum that their offending behavior could at times be beneficial and healthy, and forum users commonly attempted to relocate the responsibility for their offending from themselves onto the victim of their offences. Forum users really commonly attempted to minimize the harm, particularly among those who conducted or perpetrated online sexual offences, such as child sexual abuse material offences. This forum user said, "I'm just looking at a bunch of pixels on my computer and not hurting anyone." There was a consistent theme of denying the impacts of child sexual abuse material. In other words, saying that the victim did not experience ongoing harm by virtue of the material continuing to exist online. And the final cognitive driver that we observed on this forum was the denial of capacity for self-control. This user said, "For me, it was overwhelming and uncontrollable. It caused me to make some dangerous decisions and mistakes." So this was a really common driver to say among these forum users, that they just simply did not have the capacity for self-control and they could not be held responsible for their behavior. However, we then went on to have a bit of a closer look at the interactions between offenders and have a look at the culture of the forum. And I use that word specifically because we observed that there was indeed a forum culture, and that took the form of an offender hierarchy. In this hierarchy, there was active acknowledgement of the hierarchy. It was known to those on the forum that they had created and systematized a grouping of forum users, meaning that there were some who perceived themselves to be superior to others. There was reinforcement and regulation among the forum users. So by and large, the forum users implemented that hierarchy and made sure that it was regulated, and it was controlled over time. So this forum culture and this offender hierarchy persisted from the earlier part of the scraping of the forum all the way through to the final year of the forum scrape that we did. And what that looked like was that forum users who did not contact offend for purely moral reasons, that definition of conservative that was supplied early on, they were considered as more virtuous and moralistic than others on the forum. And this was stated relatively specifically among the forum users. This person said, "Obviously, if you made it here and if you want to stay within the community, you are better than those who get a kick out of the desolation and suffering of children." But there was a degree of hypocrisy among this group. The same user goes on to state, "The ways you could do this are many. Many writes or read stories, turn to erotic drawings, keep a small stash of child pornography." So while there were a group who viewed themselves as more moralistic, more virtuous than others, they themselves continue to offend in different ways. Next on the moral hierarchy of the forum were forum users who did not contact offend for situational reasons. These situational reasons being that they could not access children or they could not access circumstances that would support their offending. This forum user says, "We define a conservative pedophile as someone who does not have intimate sexual relations or engage in inappropriate touching with children because of moral and or ethical reasons. If you don't have those relationships because you either fear getting caught or you have no contact with children, that does not make you conservative." So again, explicit hierarchy stated by these forum users. Next were users who contact offended while reporting trying not to. This individual says, "Breaking the law is one thing, but calling it child sexual interaction molesting is where you seem to be entirely on the wrong track. There is nothing else I can offer you, but if you truly love children, then do not use the enemy's language and terms." Really importantly, and I'll just emphasize the use of the term enemy there. So there was forum users situating themselves as separate to what they considered to be the enemy or others, which were the general community. The final layer of this this hierarchy were forum users who contact offended. These individuals were present on the forum, and they described their offending and often argued against the moral hierarchy that was instilled on the forum. So these interactions were active and in conversation between forum users. And to illustrate that, taking this the final quote that I've got there, this statement was in conversation with another forum user who responded, what you see as love and affection, others see as a selfish act. It is quite possible to still believe a child cannot consent. From that viewpoint, no sexual relation with a child can be consensual, and it is an apt term. To imply that those persons either have a sadistic bent, don't love children, or are the enemy feels just as wrong to them as labeling all adult-child relations as molestation to you. So, as I said, there are ongoing interactions, justification, and regulation on the forum, and what we could only describe as a community who developed a culture that supported different types of ongoing offending. But then how does this translate to perpetration? When it comes to the live streaming of child sexual abuse, this is a persistent and quite pervasive type of offence, which is very difficult to detect and intervene with. Live streaming of child sexual abuse broadly features the procurement and viewing of the sexual abuse of children across the internet in real time, in exchange for money. It typically involves a third party who facilitates the offence, and really importantly, there are some significant barriers to monitoring by authorities. Typically, the types of evidence of these offences are metadata locally stored on an offender's computer, a financial transaction, and potentially conversations between a offender and a facilitator arranging those offences. All of those types of information are quite hard to obtain, and as a result, live streaming of child sexual abuse is quite a difficult offence to detect. So where did we get the information that we analysed? In 2018, the Philippines, police in the Philippines provided the Australian Federal Police with a list of 118 individuals arrested for facilitating the sexual exploitation of children. We refer to these individuals as the facilitators in this research. Analysis on the Australian end by AUSTRAC identified 299 Australia-based individuals who had made financial transactions with the facilitators. At the time of identification, some of these individuals had been arrested for child sexual offences, some of whom had been arrested for paying to watch child sexual abuse via live stream in different police operations. We took those financial transactions and the characteristics of them and joined those financial transactions with the criminal histories of all those 299 individuals. And I'm just going to briefly give you some of the characteristics of these individuals. Really importantly, they were an older cohort than is observed among other types of sexual offences. These individuals, as you can see, the average age was sitting, or the average kind of age range was sitting kind of above late 40s, around mid to late 50s as well. But they were making a lot of financial transactions across the time period that we had data for. There were a very large volume of transactions. But what I should note here is that we can't be certain that every individual single transaction was procuring a single offence. There were some very large financial transactions into the thousands of dollars. It is possible that those types of financial transactions were procuring a series of offences. It's also possible that the very small value transactions were procuring an individual offence using several transactions to attempt to avoid detection. However, within this data set, these 118 facilitators received a large volume of transactions from these Australia-based offenders. Among those who transacted with these individuals, the transactions were quite frequent on average. There were very few days in between those transactions for those who transacted more than once. However, there were some who transacted once or twice, and then there was a very long period of time before they began transacting again. What we can infer from this, on one hand, could be that they're very persistent offenders. It's also possible that these individuals were transacting with a number of facilitators, and they were rotating through the facilitators to avoid detection. But among the facilitators that we could observe, there were at times very long breaks in between transactions, up to the hundreds of days. That meaning that A, these facilitators were active for a very long period of time, and B, just because an offender appears to stop offending, particularly with one facilitator, doesn't mean that they won't in the long run transact with them again. But on average, as we can see, most individuals in the data transacted with a facilitator between 1 week and a month length of break. And one of the last things I'll just note here is that these were the criminal offences that we observed among this group. There were, importantly, a number of contact offences. In fact, around 15% of the sample had engaged in a contact offence against a child. And I'll just note that this was the contact sexual offences that occurred, which were recorded in their criminal histories. So this number is likely to be much higher than it is. What we can see there is that online offenders, there's no certainty that they offend in isolation online. There is a chance, and we can see among a noteworthy proportion of this sample, there was crossover between online and offline offending among this group. Separately, the Australian Institute of Criminology studied a series of offender chat logs for offenders who were procuring live streaming sessions of child sexual abuse. So, as I mentioned before, we know that perpetrators seek out and arrange offending online, and we know the content of some of these conversations. These are one of the detection opportunities for this group, and we know that these data exist somewhere. However, oftentimes they're behind kind of encrypted communications platforms. So this research found that among this group of offenders, the platforms used for discussion with perpetrators were very common online platforms. Facebook Messenger, Skype, Viber, Yahoo Messenger. They weren't necessarily the more niche platforms that you might expect, although these data were from a couple of years ago now. But also, really importantly, something we know about live streaming offenders is that the offence typically takes place on easy platforms to access, like Skype, again, Facebook Messenger. And what you'll see there is oftentimes it is the same platform across which the conversation is had, arranging that offence. And just a final note that these offenders can have a significant impact, even individually. The number of victims that they're able to perpetrate against and the number of offences that they perpetrate against those victims can be substantial. It's a quite pervasive offence type, and because of the technologically enabled nature of it, it is quite difficult to detect and disrupt. So in summary, from our research on the darknet, which we've been conducting throughout this year, child sexual offenders can and do actively seek out and interact with one another online. These interactions may feature the intentional use of technology to avoid detection. It was really important that the forum users that we observed were using the darknet to communicate. Many of them were reporting that they had a lengthy history of offending but had not been detected previously. And I don't think that there's any coincidence that they were using, for example, the darknet to communicate and engage in conversations, and they were reporting that they had not been detected for their offending. groups of perpetrators can form complex microcosms of culture, supporting continued offending and also providing each other advice. Something I haven't talked about here was a separate analysis of that forum data where offenders were providing each other advice on methodologies to avoid detection, but also ways in which to engage with, for example, psychosocial services without being detected. These online interactions can facilitate complex offending with international implications, which are quite hard to detect. But we have some research that's forthcoming, which is focusing on financial transactions in an attempt to detect and better detect and disrupt these types of offending behaviors. If you would like any further information on these reports, our Darknet research will become public later this year. And that QR code that's on your screen right now, the AIC has produced more than 50 research papers on technologically facilitated online sexual exploitation and sexual exploitation of children. Please feel free to go and have a look at what we've produced so far, and keep an eye out for what's forthcoming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timothy. And next we are going to move on to our final speaker today, who is here to reflect on what we have heard so far and give us a little bit of a Finnish perspective on the matter. I would like to welcome Maria Hietajärvi. She's a Detective Chief Inspector at the Western Uusimaa Police in Finland, and she is currently working as an investigation leader for a newly built local crimes against children investigation team in Western Uusimaa. She has been working with crimes against children investigations from 2011 and has been focusing most of her career on the online aspect of child sexual exploitation and abuse. So please welcome Maria.
Thank you, Anni, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Great.
Thanks. I'll save you from the slideshow and I'll try to speak from my notes. First of all, thank you, HEUNI and AIC, for organizing this very interesting webinar, and thank you for all the previous speakers for your presentations. And of course, for the opportunity to comment on behalf of our Finnish law enforcement and our status in this. I have been somewhat involved with this online exploitation of children, as mentioned, since 2011, and I have to see that the online environment has changed, luckily. So have the laws and other tools we are using to combat this crime as well. I still have to state, listening to all these presentations here today, that I think that in Finland we are a little bit, how to say, behind maybe in this battle against this criminality. But this is why I feel that these kind of webinars and trainings are really, really important in our ability to try to tackle this. I think that I'll first start by commenting on some of the ideas that I got from the presentations before moving to Finnish status, what we're doing now. First, to comment on Samantha's introduction of modern slavery, I like the term a lot. I think that the Finnish criminal code is somewhat similar when it comes to human trafficking than the Australian one. However, I really think that we also have just recently woken up to the fact that to the possibility that some sexual crimes against children can also be charged as human trafficking, and we should look at the cases more accurately, that they actually might be trafficking as well as they are sexual exploitation of children. On Michael's presentation on dating platforms, research was really interesting. I'm in awe by the scale of it, huge amount of respondents. I remember we've had some cases over recent years where in Finland as well, we've had some children on dating sites and dating application apps. But it got me thinking that more and more of this kind of action is actually happening also not only on dating platforms, but in the regular applications and social media sites that children are using. And it sort of raises the question of if 60% of these 9% of kids that were using the dating apps while underage, that were receiving sexual exploitative requests, and they might be more tend to re-victimization. How is the situation with the kids that are actually receiving this kind of sexually exploitative requests on their own area where they should be safe in the social media apps that they are actually using just regularly? It might need some more research, maybe in the future. And lastly, to Dr. Timothy's research. Wow, what a research program you have! We have a lot to learn from your data. I will definitely be looking into it. I'm especially interested in the forthcoming research of sexual extortion, since we are seeing more and more extortion cases here in Finland, from adult perpetrators, but from peers as well. Teenagers seem to be extorting each other to sending nudes and saying that they will distribute them if they don't get paid or get more nudes or whatever. And of course the live streaming research is really interesting as well. We've had some cases. We had a couple of years ago a big case where there was live streaming done also on common platforms such as Skype, but as Timothy mentioned, it's really difficult to detect these kind of crimes, even though we know that it's happening in Finland as well. But I was asked to highlight a little bit about what's happening in Finland. I was few years back working in a national project, Project Barnahus, where we did a round tour with all of our 11 police districts in Finland, and we were trying to ask our colleagues what are the things that would need to be really would need some more training and emphasis in crimes against children investigations, and online child sexual exploitation was one of the recommendations, one of the 10 recommendations that we got from this tour. And this led us to writing a handbook in Finland for the pretrial investigations of crimes against children. And there in this handbook, we wrote one chapter specifically for crimes against online crimes against children. We also were able to start national training in Police University College on this online sexual crimes against children specifically. And this has now become a part of the yearly training program there, which is really nice. And for third thing we did on basis of these surveys, we revised the ongoing NICHD protocol for investigative interviewing for children. We are using this protocol in Finland when interviewing children in these as victims of crime, and there was some difficulty in the bringing forward some evidence that police might already have of the case if the child is not disclosing. So we revised the protocol concentrating on the suggestions how to bring forward this kind of information that police might already have, like see some pictures of the child or victim, or chat logs, as mentioned in the previous presentations, that we might have if the child doesn't tell anything. So that was something that we built up to help in these investigations. The prevalence of the online cases in Finland was something that I was really interested in myself, and in my studies I did my master thesis of this, as I found out that we don't actually have in Finland statistics, adequate statistics to tell how much of these sexual crimes against children that come to police knowledge are happening actually online or in any kind of apps. And I focused on of course on the criminal reports, the data that police actually has, and I narrowed it down to recent cases, so the reports that have been made during the year 2022. So the results were that from my data sample, that was a little under 2,000 criminal reports in 2022 made to police, 58% was I classified it as online sexual exploitation, meaning that these crimes had happened online, or there was something, some kind of online aspect in them, so that there was some CSAM distributing or asking, or the initial contact was made online. I also searched for the platform where the crime had happened, and found out that the 5 most common platforms where sexual exploitation of children is happening now in Finland are Snapchat. Almost half of the cases were in Snapchat, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, and Kik Messenger. So really common platforms which children are using. Facebook was mostly about the CSAM distribution, since kids don't use Facebook maybe themselves that much. But to conclude, I have to say that we need definitely more research in this phenomena in Finland as well, and
Maria, are you still there? I think we have lost you. Maybe we will wait for a few seconds and see if we can get Maria back on. Can you hear me? Just like to check if you can hear my voice, please. Yes, you can. Perhaps we could try and answer the question in the chat before we get Maria back on. There's a question to Michael. How is dating app facilitated sexual violence defined? So Michael, could you please respond to this question? Thank you.
No worries. So we defined dating app facilitated sexual violence as online or in-person sexual violence, aggression, and harassment perpetrated by individuals who respondents to the survey had met on a dating platform. And in the context of the survey, it was any of these that had occurred in the previous 5 years. So some examples of online sexual violence can include any form of sexual harassment, abusive or threatening language, image-based sexual abuse and stalking, as long as it's online. And then offline sexual violence included in-person sexual assault or coercion, reproductive and sexual health related abuse, and in-person image-based sexual abuse and in-person stalking. So this definition was used across all of the research papers that have come out of that survey. So yeah, that's how we define it.
Thank you very much. It seems that we still don't have Maria back online. So perhaps we can take some other questions if you have. Oh, there we have Maria. Great. Maybe you can still go on and give us some final points that you still had. Thank you. We had one question in between from the audience, but you can continue now.
Yes, that's really good that you were able to move on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great.
Yes, the online environment.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know where did you where did I fly off, but I think that just to conclude that in the end that the future is looking more bright. I think we have more research coming from Finland as well from law enforcement side, the EU-funded Erica project, as well as some NGOs that are really active in Finland in this field. There's our Protect Children Finland that is working with the data from dark web as well. They are having really interesting research, and we have a really active In Hope partner, Save the Children Finland as well. And I think that in law enforcement, as the new generation is more competently working on online environments. So I think that this, together with the new EU legislation that will put some more demand for ISPs, for internet service providers, is going to hopefully move this field forward in Finland as well. But just thank you for the presenters for really good speeches.
Thank you very much, Maria. And also thank you to all other speakers as well. So next up, we have some time remaining for questions and comments. So you can raise your hand and then I can give the floor in the order of appearance. There are also questions in the chat. And before anyone raises their hand, we can start with the questions in the chat. Sorry, just a second. I'm gonna catch up. There is one question, perhaps to all speakers. You can choose who would like to answer that. How can we monitor Snapchat as parental controls don't work? As it is a kids app, there is info on the web on how to create profiles and how to bypass parental controls. I wonder if Michael perhaps would like to, if you've had any insights from your data on the role of technology and the dating apps and how their perhaps responsibility could be increased, and actually also it would be interesting to hear how, if you have any information, how the apps see their own responsibility at the moment in this role of facilitating these harms in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't say as much for Snapchat in the context of the current research. I can say that for dating apps, I mentioned it a little bit in the presentation that they have measures such as age verification, which is where they use a government issued ID to, like as the name suggests, to verify the age of the person signing up to the platform. But as I also mentioned, this isn't mandatory. So it's something that users can still bypass and still access the app without actually using that age verification. So I guess there needs to be more onus on these platforms to actually be stricter with what they're using, the features that they're using, to make sure that people aren't able to bypass them.
Thank you, Michael. There's also a question for Timothy. There's an attendee commenting that I find it interesting, your findings in respect to offender age. A number of current risk assessment tools typically associate younger offenders as being considered higher risk. So how do you view the finding that you have in respect to current risk tools or other research available? And based on the experience you have, do you think AIC could potentially produce a revised tool for the Australian context that might be able to better suit your Australian demographic or improve offender monitoring?
Yeah, it's a really good point. The findings in relation to offender age, particularly for the live streaming group, were surprising to us. They were an older cohort. One thing I'll note just with that is that it may be a bias introduced by the facilitator or the grouping of facilitators. It's possible that these facilitators were favored by offenders who are slightly older. But that aside, we do quite a bit of research at the AIC into what risk factors and risk markers, quantifying risk among different offender groups. At the moment, in terms of the live streaming work, we're looking at what are the potential risk factors among the data that we have regarding financial transactions. So because we don't have a large amount of kind of demographic or behavioral information about those offenders, what we do have is a large amount of information on their financial transactions. So we're developing a project on identifying the financial transactions that indicate a risk for procuring live streaming of child sexual abuse from different areas, particularly the Philippines. So really long answer to your question. Yes, we're trying to assess risk in the way that this data allows us to, and with the live streaming work, I think it would be really valuable if more data became available on the behavioral characteristics of this group. I think a live streaming specific risk assessment is possible to develop, but with the data that we have at the moment, the best we can do is to assess the risk of different types of financial transactions and kind of work with financial services to better identify the risk that those transactions pose.
Thank you, Timothy. There are a few questions related to the darknet, which I think you might be able to respond also. So up until recent years, darknet was mostly not fast enough to facilitate online live streaming. Has that changed?
So from our research, we find that the majority of the live streaming, the actual functional live streaming and direction of the abuse occurs across mainstream platforms rather than occurring across the darknet itself. However, we can't know at this point whether those offences were initially arranged, for example, whether the initial contact with the facilitator was across the darknet, or whether offender interactions on the darknet shared information about contacting facilitators. So what we do find is that those are separate processes, but the contact between an offender and a facilitator and the streaming itself can occur across similar or the same platforms. Typically, those platforms are more mainstream but encrypted platforms.
And another one, were alias profiles created for research safety to watch on dark web? How was this went about?
Yeah, really good question. This one was a really tough project to negotiate with ethics. Obviously, we had to get ethics approval to conduct the research. We partnered with the Cybercrime Observatory at the Australian National University to scrape the data from the darknet, and as part of the research process, we scraped a large volume of data, and then that data was in part redacted. So any descriptions of actual offences against children or anything that could be deemed literature on child sexual abuse, that was redacted from the data for the protection of researchers.
Thank you very much. Next, we have a question for Michael. What is the hypothesis as to why those under 18 that received sexually explicit requests then experienced higher levels of other forms of online or real-world harms?
So the reason, we can't say for sure what the reason is or what our hypothesis is, but we can say that our findings do support what other researchers also found. We found that the impacts of child sexual abuse are related to subsequent sexual re-victimization. There's a number of studies that we look at where child sexual abuse then results in future re-victimization. So this is a serious issue, but in terms of the hypothesis, something we'll have to look into further.
Thank you. Then there's another question related to games and texting apps. I wonder if you have any information or research available on online gaming platforms and sexual exploitation, such as Roblox, Minecraft, Valorant, and so forth, where children can be just as accessible, maybe even more so. Are we seeing these future trends are we seeing these as future trends, and how have you been?
I guess, sorry, this might be a good time to plug the future research that the OSEC team is conducting. We're currently conducting a survey of Australian adolescents and their experiences with sending sexual images, catfishing, and also sexual extortion. Within that survey, we do ask respondents what platforms these experiences have occurred on, and those listed platforms include a number of gaming platforms. So while I can't say for sure whether those gaming platforms are resulting in experiences of catfishing or sexual extortion, I can say that the research that we're doing may give us insight into that. So watch this space, keep an eye out on the AIC website, and that research will be out very, very soon.
Definitely, very topical. Thank you. Then there's a question to Timothy and Maria. Could viewers and perpetrators of online streaming of CSA be tried for human trafficking, modern slavery in Australia and Finland, respectively? In Norway, there is, for example, a 2016 conviction for aggravated trafficking for involvement in live streaming of CSA from Philippines.
I can start from Finnish side. I of course can't be sure of how it would go, but I know that it's been tried to get human trafficking as one of the charges in the last case, but it didn't go through, so it went just by sexual offenses. But this is something. This is really an ongoing discussion currently that we're trying to figure out what are the limits in charging with only sexual offenses or also human trafficking.
What I
can, yeah, thank you. Sorry, go on.
It's okay. So what I can add from the Australian perspective, what we've observed among those who transacted with facilitators in the Philippines was that there were, for those who were detected and prosecuted, there were some child sexual offences in there, also financial crime offences. So the transaction itself was obviously procuring the live streaming or transacting with the facilitator. That by virtue of the evidence that left behind and becoming detectable, that led to some criminal prosecutions. In terms of whether it's possible, that's probably a question for Samantha, which I think is why she's come up on the stream. I'll pass over to you, Sam. You might know better than me.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think the conceptualization of offenders in this space is really interesting, and how we consider what their roles are. And I think there is some discussion about whether people who communicate with facilitators to procure live streaming of child sexual abuse could be considered as facilitators themselves, in which case they potentially could be tried as under human trafficking offences. That hasn't occurred in the Australian context, as far as I'm aware. So the majority of these cases of live streaming, and same as what Natalia was asked here, cases involving CSA in the Philippines, those offenders in Australia who have been viewing live streaming have been charged under the Commonwealth, our national child exploitation legislation, rather than any human trafficking legislation. But I think it is a really interesting conversation, and one that is happening to see if there are other ways that we can view offenders, and whether there are other tools and other pieces of legislation that we could potentially use against them, in addition to Commonwealth child exploitation as state and territory legislation. There's also that human trafficking element, which carries the most serious penalties as well. So there's a discussion that's happening, but it hasn't been tested in Australian context yet. But also to note, I think that we've got some Australian Federal Police colleagues on the call right now, and they might have some views on that as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This one is for Timothy. Did your data give you any insight on the affect treatment for the population of offenders?
Sorry, could you repeat that one? It just
yes,
broke up a little bit.
Did you get any insights from your data on how would the treatment for the population of offenders, how is that seen in your data? What would be the results for the treatment for the population of offenders?
I assume that this is in relation to kind of psychosocial treatment for the offending group on the darknet. We did look into conversations around these perpetrators attempting to access treatment to desist from their offending, actively attempting to desist prior to their detection. So these were individuals who identified that they were child sexual offenders, but they were attempting to desist, and in doing so were attempting to seek help in one way or another. These conversations were in the context of sharing how to access treatment without disclosing their offence history, and thereby triggering mandatory reporting criteria in Australia. Almost universally, the respondents were seeking psychosocial help, help through community services, counselling services, psychological care. There was a general view among forum users that this was the most appropriate way to support their desistance, but that it was extremely high risk. So the strategies that were discussed related to how they could provide limited information to counselling services, so they didn't trigger the reporting criteria, but they could still in some way obtain care to support their desistance. So we have a standalone paper that focuses on those types of factors, those types of conversations on the darknet. The views of forum users who were looking to obtain psychosocial help, and their approaches, generally speaking, their approaches to supporting their desistance from contact and online offending. So again, that's one that's working its way through our publications process at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. We have run out of time, unfortunately. There was still a few questions in the chat that were not answered. I hope you can send your questions directly to the speakers after the event, so maybe they would have time to respond. We've added some resources to the chat, and I'm also posting now a feedback form. We would be very grateful if you take 1 minute to give us some feedback on the event. Thank you again to the speakers. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you had an informative session, and hope you have a great day and a great evening. Thank you very much. Don't hesitate to be in contact. Bye.